All right, everybody, what is good? We're back. Another Next.js tutorial video. So last week, we set up Next.js for the first time on our machines. Pardon me if I sound sick, by the way. I'm fighting something. I don't know what's going on with me, but we're pushing through that. So last week, or last video, we set up Next.js for the first time on our machines. This week, we're going to go over some more of the basics before we actually hop into a project. So the project that we're going to do, just for future reference, we're going to be building like a fake blog type of thing using Next.js. And to accomplish that, we're going to be using JSON placeholder, which is just a free API, simple to use. So once we get to that point, we'll explain more in depth. But for now, that's just what we're doing for future reference, so we can actually like learn the material. Because if you're like me, you learn by doing and you learn by messing up. So hey, that's the way we're going to do it. So picking back up from last week, now that we have our project set up, you can see here in our editor, we have our Learning Next.js repo. Again, if you didn't watch the last video, go ahead and watch it. Or if you already know how to set up Next.js, the repo link is in this video description. So, like we said from last week, Next.js was already installed. We have our Learning Next.js project right here. So we're going to go over the basic folder or file organizations or conventions of Next.js before we get into any coding. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into it. Folders. Top level folders are used to organize the application's code and static assets, just like the site says right here. So going into a little bit more detail, we have the app router, the pages router. Pages router and app router you're going to hear a lot about. We're going to make a separate video explaining this, but the pages router is basically the legacy router that Next.js used before version 13. Currently, we're on 15 for the sake of this, so we don't even have a reason to really go over this in detail, but in the separate video, I'll talk about it just so you can understand. App router is the newest router that they added post 13. So this is what we're currently using. So for the sake of all of our tutorials, we're going to be using the app router because that's the recommended way by Vercel, aka Next.js. Public, that's going to be where our static assets live. So images, logos, all that fun stuff that we plan on using throughout our site, we'll put those there. Anything that's not dynamic that we're getting from an API. So we have like a static logo, like they have here, the Next.js logo, that'll typically be in our public directory. Source, if you remember from last week, we had in the command line in Access, do we want to use a source directory or not? It's optional, but typically I like to use that just because previously with other languages and other code bases, you have a source folder and that's literally where all your code lives. And it helps keep things separate from the other config files that live like above the source directory or beside the source directory. So let's go ahead and look into the code really quick. So just like I said, we have public. You can see in here, we have just some different logos. So right here, we have the Next.js logo, like I said. So any logo or static file that you want to host, you will put this in your public directory. Source, remember, it's the optional directory. You don't have to use it, but it just helps keep things organized. So inside of source, we have the app router, like I said. This is going to control all of the directory routing or app routing throughout the application itself. We'll talk more about this in a separate video, but just know that for now. And now let's move on to the actual config files that we see throughout the repo so far. Moving on to top level files. So these are used to configure the application, manage your dependencies, run middleware, integrate tools, and define environment variables and much more, just like the site says here. So what are these files consisting of? So these are the top level files like we see in our repo right now, like nextconfig, package.json, post.css, tailwind, TS, all that fun stuff. These are what they mean by top level files. They literally live at the top level of your application. A good way to think about it. So the nextconfig.js, that is a configuration file for Next.js. Package.json, like we touched a little bit on this last week. This is where our project dependencies and our scripts will live. Instrumentation, we don't use that right now, but open to telemetry and instrumentation file. Middleware, we'll talk about this in a later tutorial when we're actually building out and coding. Environment files are, you have like environment, you have your local one, production and development. Why do you have different variations? So for instance, when you're doing like local dev, you may want to be testing with a development database. Of course, you never want to really hit production, like the live database that your customers are seeing or whatever. You want to have separate configurations for each way that you're working. So if you're developing locally, you want to have like a local database, or you want to use your development database. So that way you have no fear of crashing your site or anything like that. And then of course, when you deploy, You'll have the production environment file, which is what's used in your production application. So it'll have different variables that you use throughout your application for each environment, basically. Git ignore, basically ignoring what files that you commit to Git. So typically you don't want to commit your environment files to Git just because sometimes you'll have like sensitive information in there. So again, we'll go over this when we're actually starting the code, but just good practice to know. Never commit your environment files to GitHub unless you have like a static one that doesn't have any sensitive data in there and you're just trying to have like a template so other people can use. ESLint, that is just configuration for your ESLint module. Next environment, TypeScript declaration for Next.js, and tsconfig, configuration file for TypeScript. We don't use JSconfig, we use TypeScript. So again, it's the same thing, but it's just config file for JavaScript. But we're not worried about that. We only worry about TypeScript around here. So actually looking into our code base. So let's see. Let's start with our git ignore. So this is literally, like I said, everything in this file is what's not being committed to GitHub. So you can see here, we have environment files not being committed. You can always opt in and commit like a template, like a .environment.template, just so people know what variables to look for. And then you will have the value stored in like a secure place like Keeper or whatever. But yeah, that's the git ignore, every file that you don't want committed into GitHub. Moving on, ESLint is typically our ESLint config. Tells us different standards of how our code should be. It'll throw errors depending on what type of configuration that you have. We'll probably run into this as we're coding. So for now, that's what ESLint is. It just monitors your code, makes sure that you're following basically standards. Next config, this is the configuration file for Next.js. So you can add a lot of things here. So as we're coding, we'll play around with this a lot more, but just keep this in mind. This is an important file, by the way. So we'll talk more about this as we're coding. Package JSON, you remember this from last week. So this manages all of our app's dependencies and scripts. So in our scripts, you can see from last week, we had our next dev. That's how we actually run our app. We have a build command, which is what we typically use before we deploy our app. We have the start command, which is used after we build it. So if you want to mimic how your app would run in production, you would do a build first and then you would start it just to get a good sense of how it would act. Lint checks your code base and makes sure that you're adhering to standards. So if you have like a mistyped variable or something's out of place, typically lint would catch this. Sometimes, not all the time, but it's a good thing to have. Dependencies. So in our case, we're using Next.js 15, which has dependencies on React and React DOM. For those of you that don't know, React 19 has not been fully released yet, but we're not doing a production app here. We're just getting started with a basic tutorial. So keep that in mind. React 19 is not fully released and they say it's not production safe yet. So again, this is just tutorial. So we're just going with the latest and greatest. And you can see here we have dev dependencies. So a quick note, dependencies are what your app actually rely on to run. Dev dependencies are what your app needs during dev time. So after your app builds, these are the main three things that your app needs. But while you're developing, these are the dependencies that you need. So just a quick little tidbit right there. And that's about it. And then of course we have a README, which just tells what your app is about. So this is, for anybody who comes to the repo, for example, if you go to the repo in the link and you click that, this is what you would see. Typically helpful to help other developers, basically run the app and learn like, all right, what everything is needed. And Tailwind, that's just like configuring for our CSS. That's automatically configured by Next.js. So we really don't have to do this. This is only if you want to extend it and add some cool things. So when we're coding, we'll play around with this a little more. But for now, this is already set up how we need it. And then tsconfig, TypeScript configuration. You can add a lot of different options here and take out things. But for now, we're going to leave everything as is. All right. So for the sake of this video, we're going to pause right here because these other files and other routes and whatnot, these kind of overlap with the app router video that we're going to make. So I'm going to pause here on what we covered today and save all of this for the next video, which will probably be a little bit more chunky because it's going to cover a lot. So the app router will be like one of the most important things to get like a handle on. So I'm going to save all of this, talking about all of this other stuff until the next video. So I hope you guys got a quick gist of it. Of course, you can always go back and read the documentation. I'll link the Next.js, of course, docs link in the video. The repo link is also in this video. And remember, we're going to be updating that repo as we code. But for now, right now, we're just trying to get the gist of everything before we even get down and get our hands dirty coding. So until next time, I appreciate y'all watching. If y'all have any questions or if I misspoke or mislabeled anything, let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Like I said, we're going to be getting a lot more consistent with uploading videos here. So until next time, y'all, peace out.